Salt of the Earth, 1954. Salt of the Earth didn't just challenge Hollywood norms, it collided head-on with Cold War politics. Made by Blacklisted filmmakers, including director Herbert Biberman and screenwriter Michael Wilson, the film was deemed subversive before it even reached theaters. Its plot, based on a real miners' strike in Grant County, New Mexico from October 1950 to January 1952, portrayed Mexican-American workers, and notably their wives, demanding equality on the picket line. That alone unsettled post-war America, but the film went further, spotlighting immigrant voices, feminist leadership, and class struggle with unapologetic clarity. Lead actress Rosaura Revueltas, a Mexican national, was detained mid-production on what officials claimed were visa violations, though many historians argue the move was politically motivated. After her deportation, remaining scenes were completed using body doubles and tight camera work. Some accounts suggest that portions of the footage were smuggled across the border to evade government seizure. The reaction was swift. According to reports, the FBI and American Legion pressured theaters not to screen the film. Distribution was so restricted that it reportedly played in fewer than a dozen US venues. Myth has it that projectionists refused to handle the reels, and some theaters allegedly received anonymous threats. The film became radioactive, nearly erased from public consciousness for decades. Yet its legacy endured. Shot with a blend of professional actors and actual miners and their families, the film's documentary-like realism helped cement its reputation as a landmark in labor cinema. It also broke ground with his portrayal of working-class women organizing for justice, a rarity at the time. In 1992, the Library of Congress added Salt of the Earth to the National Film Registry, calling it culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Today it stands not just as a film, but as a defiant artifact of an era that tried to silence it. The Miracle, 1950. The Miracle became one of the most controversial film segments of its time, not for box office numbers, but for what it unleashed in the US legal system. Directed by Roberto Rossellini and written by Federico Fellini, who also appeared in the film, the 42-minute segment was part of the Italian anthology L'Amore. It followed a woman, portrayed by Anna Magnani, who believes her pregnancy is a divine act after an encounter with a man she mistakes for a saint. The religious overtones sparked outrage when the film screened in New York. Initially approved by the state's Motion Picture Division, the film's license was later revoked by the New York Board of Regents, citing a decades-old statute that allowed censoring content deemed sacrilegious. That decision led to a legal battle, which reached the U.S. Supreme Court in 1952. The court unanimously ruled that motion pictures are a form of expression protected under the First Amendment, striking down the ban. While the ruling didn't invent film protections from scratch, it expanded them in a way that reshaped American cinema. Some legal scholars argue this case helped dismantle the power of state-run censorship boards. And though few moviegoers today remember the Miracle itself, its courtroom legacy is still felt. Legends in film circles say it helped liberate the American screen, a phrase often attributed, albeit loosely, to historian Leonard J. Leff. Mission to Moscow, 1943. Mission to Moscow is more than just another wartime production. It emerged as one of the most contentious works of Hollywood's golden age. Overseen by Michael Curtis, soon to win an Oscar for Casablanca, it was developed with significant guidance from the U.S. Office of War Information and backed by Warner Brothers at the urging of former Ambassador Joseph E. Davies. The objective? To reshape American attitudes toward the Soviet Union, at that point a vital ally against Nazi Germany. The screenplay, crafted by Howard Koch, cast Stalin's government in an unexpectedly positive light, even attempting to justify the notorious Moscow trials, widely dismissed in the West as political theatrics. Critics later branded it overt propaganda, but amid wartime, smoothing over ideological rifts was considered by some a strategic necessity. Howard later insisted he was operating under government direction, though the extent of any official involvement remains disputed. In the post-war era, the Cold War made the film radioactive. In 1947, HUAC cited Mission to Moscow as supposed evidence of communist leanings in Hollywood. Warner Brothers leaders, including Jack Warner, were summoned before Congress. Koch, despite co-writing Casablanca, was blacklisted and spent years writing under pseudonyms, mostly outside the American film scene. He would not receive official Hollywood credit again until the 1960s. These days, the picture is seldom screened but frequently scrutinized. a prime illustration of how propaganda, politics, and filmmaking collided. Some observers deem it naive, others implicate it as deliberately complicit. Still others ask whether it was a well-intentioned miscalculation or a shrewd gamble that backfired when global politics shifted course. Try and Get Me, 1950. Try and Get Me didn't just court controversy, it became a casualty of it. Originally released as The Sound of Fury in December of 1950, the film dramatized the real-life 1933 lynching of two men in San Jose, California, an event that drew over 6,000 onlookers and shocked the nation. Director Cy Enfield used the story to expose the dangers of mob violence and media manipulation, crafting a noir that struck nerves with its unfiltered critique of American groupthink. But the timing couldn't have been worse. As Cold War paranoia tightened its grip, the film's raw depiction of vigilante justice triggered backlash. In several cities, particularly across the Midwest and the South, the film was yanked from theaters after protests and official complaints. Some local leaders accused it of inciting unrest. Critics, however, took a different view. The New York Times called it one of the most forceful social dramas in years. Still, many audience members weren't prepared to embrace its themes. Rumors circulated that studio executives distanced themselves to avoid drawing attention during the House Un-American Activities Committee's Hollywood dragnet. Enfield, already under suspicion for alleged communist ties, was blacklisted not long after the release. By 1952, he had left the United States and rebuilt his directing career in the United Kingdom, later helming Zulu in 1964. Meanwhile, Try and Get Me faded from view. For decades, it was nearly impossible to find, with only rare screenings keeping its memory alive. It wasn't until a 2004 restoration by the Film Noir Foundation that the film re-emerged, prompting critics to revisit its significance. Now regarded as a bold indictment of mob psychology, the movie's disappearance is often seen as a reflection of the era's climate of fear. A number of film experts contend it wasn't just the content that made it dangerous. It was the unforgiving mirror it held up to American society during one of its most anxious chapters. Fury, 1936. In 1936, MGM released Fury, a searing indictment of mob justice that unsettled censors and shook audiences. Directed by Fritz Lang in his first American film, Fury tackled a taboo subject, lynching. The original script, inspired by the real-life lynching of two Filipino men in San Jose, California in 1933, was far more explicit in its racial commentary. Under intense pressure from the Hays Code Office and studio executives, the narrative was refocused around a white protagonist, played by Spencer Tracy, who narrowly escapes death at the hands of an enraged crowd. The racial dynamic was scrubbed, but the message remained volatile. The Production Code Administration reportedly objected to the film's depiction of mob violence, fearing it could incite unrest or reflect poorly on American society. While the film passed national censors, it faced resistance in parts of the South, where local theater owners and censorship boards quietly restricted or avoided screenings. No formal bans were documented, but distribution in those regions was clearly strained. Some speculate that the film's portrayal of collective violence struck too close to home for communities with histories they preferred not to revisit. Fritz, who had fled Nazi Germany just 2 years earlier, saw Fury as a warning against authoritarianism and the dangers of blind conformity. Though no direct quote survives, colleagues recalled him saying he came to America to make films about injustice. The controversy didn't derail the film. It earned a nomination for Best Writing Original Story at the Academy Awards and helped rebrand Tracy as a serious dramatic actor. But Fury showed how even sanitized depictions of social violence could trigger backlash in a country still unwilling to confront its own darkest impulses. Storm Center, 1956. Storm Center was among the first Hollywood releases to overtly take on the McCarthy era's political tension, not through subtext but plainly. Bette Davis starred as a small-town librarian who refuses to pull a controversial book from the shelves, igniting outrage in her conservative community. The storyline was straightforward, yet its ramifications were far from simple. Debuting in the midst of anti-communist upheaval, the film drew swift condemnation from right-wing figures. Some conservative groups allegedly branded it as seditious, and its release was restricted in certain regions, though conclusive evidence of outright bans is lacking. Rumors arose that Davis received large amounts of hate mail and threats for her role. The film's central statement, defending free speech and intellectual autonomy, posed a political gamble. Academy Award-winning screenwriter Daniel Taradash, celebrated for From Here to Eternity, grappled with securing support for the film. Multiple studios turned it down, cautious of the potential blowback. United Artists finally took it on, but only after others walked away. Storm Center received mixed notices from mainstream reviewers, yet it won commendations from organizations like the American Library Association. As time passed, it gathered a dedicated following as one of the few mid-century films to explicitly defy the culture of censorship and fear. Home of the Brave, 1949. Home of the Brave made an audacious strike at Hollywood customs, and felt the consequences. Adapted from Arthur Lawrence's stage work, the production initially focused on anti-Semitism, but director Mark Robson and producer Stanley Kramer chose a risky divergence. They recast the lead as a black soldier confronting racism in the US military, portrayed by James Edwards. The decision unsettled post-war audiences. Military cooperation was non-existent. The US Army refused to assist, denying access to equipment and filming sites. Although no formal reason was stated, film scholars propose that the refusal stemmed from the movie's frank depiction of discrimination, coming just a year after President Truman's executive order of 1948 desegregated the armed forces. While policy had changed, unease with the topic still persisted. Opposition trailed the film into theaters. Although official state bans were not recorded, several Southern cinema owners are said to have dropped the picture under pressure from segregationists. In certain locales, showings were abruptly canceled with no explanation. Its open conversation about race relations hit hard in areas firmly attached to Jim Crow. James Edwards gave a standout portrayal, drawing admiration from reviewers. Yet his career trajectory faltered. Although he later contributed to acclaimed titles like The Steel Helmet and The Manchurian Candidate, leading roles remained scarce. In a 1960 interview with the Los Angeles Sentinel, Edwards hinted at an unwritten industry backlash against disruptors, though he refrained from naming names. In spite of the backlash, Home of the Brave garnered strong accolades among progressives. Mark Robson claimed Best Director from the New York Film Critics Circle, and civil rights groups lauded the film as a milestone. Even so, its distribution was curtailed. Some believe this amounted to a subtle blacklisting, a quiet shelving rather than a direct prohibition. Today, Home of the Brave is recognized as one of the earliest American features to address racism in the military directly. It paved the path for later works tackling similar subject matter. But in 1949, it stood largely alone, traversing a cultural battlefield with nerve and repercussions. Native Land, 1942. Native Land pushed boundaries few films of its time dared to touch. Directed by Leo Hurwitz and Paul Strand, and narrated by Paul Robeson, it blurred the line between documentary and drama, mixing real labor footage with staged reenactments to spotlight the violent suppression of union organizers in the United States. The film portrayed corporations hiring infiltrators, workers being intimidated, and activists facing brutal retaliation. At a time when patriotic war films dominated theaters, this politically charged exposé stood out, and not in a way that made distributors comfortable. Native Land hit a wall of quiet resistance. Theaters hesitated to screen it. Distributors backed away. The film's leftist themes, combined with Robeson's outspoken political views and Hurwitz's affiliations, placed it under a cloud of suspicion. Federal surveillance followed, though how quickly it began remains debated. Some speculate the FBI had eyes on the project from the start, given Robeson's prominence and Hurwitz's known associations. What's clear is that by the early Cold War era, the film had all but vanished from mainstream circulation. Hurwitz struggled to find work in the industry for years. Robeson, meanwhile, faced mounting government pressure, including the revocation of his passport in 1950. As for Native Land, it lingered in obscurity, kept alive in activist and documentary circles, until a wave of film scholars in the 1980s began re-evaluating its historical and artistic significance. Today, it's remembered less for its brief run and more for its fearless critique of power, and how easily that critique was buried. Black Legion, 1937. In early 1937, Warner Brothers released Black Legion, a film that pulled no punches. Starring a pre-superstardom Humphrey Bogart, the project marked a sharp turn from his usual tough guy roles, casting him as a factory worker drawn into a violent underground group. Unlike most crime dramas of the era, this one hit dangerously close to home. It was directly based on the true murder of Charles Poole, a Detroit WPA organizer killed by members of the actual Black Legion, a white supremacist group operating in the Midwest and linked to several high-profile crimes in the 1930s. The film dramatized how economic anxiety and racial resentment could turn ordinary workers into extremists. Bogart's character, driven by jealousy over a lost promotion, descends into radicalization, mirroring the real group's appeal to disillusioned white men. Critics applauded the film's blunt realism, but that praise didn't shield it from controversy. Distribution reportedly met resistance in parts of the American South, where theaters hesitated to screen a picture tackling racial extremism so directly. Though the Production Code Administration approved its release, some believe it only passed after the studio emphasized its anti-violence message. Whispers circulated that Warner Brothers faced blowback behind the scenes, including hate mail and pressure from groups unhappy with the film's subject matter. Despite limited regional screenings, Black Legion made waves. Film historians later pointed out that it was one of the boldest studio efforts of the decade to confront domestic extremism head-on. For Bogart, it was a turning point, proof that he could handle serious, socially charged material, not just gangster flicks. And for Warner Brothers, it was a calculated risk that pushed the boundaries of what mainstream Hollywood dared to say in the late 1930s. The Well, 1951. The Well bypassed mere boundary pushing. It barreled past them. Released in an era when most Hollywood productions sidestepped race entirely, this independently made drama begins with a missing black child in a deeply divided town. What follows isn't a whodunit, but a gripping examination of communal paranoia and ingrained prejudice. Co-directed by Russell Rouse and Leo Popkin, its unflinching realism was highly unusual for its period. In parts of Georgia and Alabama, though, it was deemed too provocative. Local authorities barred it completely, fearing it might incite unrest. Other cities delayed or quietly tucked away its release. Trade accounts from the time indicate many southern distributors avoided it altogether, wary of backlash. Some have surmised that the picture's direct message rendered it volatile during the Red Scare, when progressive themes were often conflated with subversion. Nevertheless, The Well beat the odds, capturing 2 Academy Award nominations, for Best Original Screenplay and Best Film Editing. While no formal NAACP endorsement is confirmed, press coverage from the day suggests discreet approval from civil rights advocates. Yet despite critical praise, its audience remained limited. Many theaters refused to run it, and others confined it to less desirable showtimes. Though not the first film to grapple with race, works like Pinky and Home of the Brave came earlier, The Well distinguished itself with its bare-bones, almost documentary tension. Largely overlooked now, it was incendiary for its era, urging viewers to address the racial divide unflinchingly, ready or not. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.